Good evening, seekers. Tonight, in the fourth chapter of our third book, we travel back to a land where rivers carried more than water. They carried grain, mud, boats, trade, stories, and the beginnings of recorded thought. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where the earth could be generous one season and merciless the next, human beings gathered in growing settlements and began shaping a world that could no longer depend on memory alone. Fields had to be measured, harvests had to be counted, offerings had to be recorded, agreements had to survive beyond the voices of the people who made them. And so, somewhere among the courtyards, workshops, temples, and storehouses of ancient Mesopotamia, marks pressed into wet clay began to hold meaning. The first written words did not arrive as poetry, philosophy, or sacred revelation. They emerged from the ordinary pressures of life. A city could not grow without knowing what entered its gates and what left them. A temple could not manage its fields, animals, workers, and stores by trusting every detail to spoken recollection. As communities became larger, memory became fragile. One person remembered one number, another remembered something else, and time slowly altered every account. Clay offered a solution. It was everywhere beneath their feet, soft when wet, firm when dry, and patient enough to outlast the people who touched it. A small tablet could preserve a transaction long after the grain had been eaten and the merchant had gone home. At first, the signs were closer to pictures than language. A simple shape could stand for barley, an animal, a container, or a number. Yet even these early marks carried a quiet power. They allowed thought to leave the human body and remain behind. Until then, every law, debt, prayer, name, and story depended upon a living voice. Once pressed into clay, an idea could wait. It could cross a room without being spoken, pass from one generation to another, and speak again beneath the hands of someone born long after its maker had died. Writing did not simply preserve words. It changed what human beings were capable of remembering together. The people who made these marks lived in a landscape that demanded organization. The rivers did not rise with the gentle regularity later associated with the Nile. Their floods could come violently, breaking banks and drowning fields, while dry months could harden the ground and leave canals empty. Survival depended upon cooperation. Water had to be directed through channels, embankments had to be repaired, and fields had to be divided so that entire communities could eat. These shared tasks encouraged villages to grow into cities, and cities created needs that no single mind could contain. The larger the settlement became, the more it depended upon records. In that sense, writing was not an isolated invention made by a lone genius. It was the answer to a civilization becoming too complex to remember itself. Among the earliest and greatest of these cities was Uruk, a place of walls, temples, crowded streets, and immense ambition. By the late 4th millennium before the Common Era, it had become one of the largest urban centers the world had yet seen. From a distance, its temples would have risen above the flat plain, visible to farmers and travelers approaching across the fields. Within the city, officials received goods, laborers carried baskets, craftspeople shaped pottery and metal, and scribes learned to turn quantities into signs. The tablets they produced were small, but the change they represented was enormous. For the first time, a city was beginning to create a memory outside the minds of its people. The tool of the scribe was simple, a cut reed pressed into damp clay. Over time, rounded pictures gave way to sharper impressions made by the angled tip of the reed. These wedge-shaped marks became what we now call cuneiform, from a later word meaning wedge. The signs were arranged with increasing care, and their meanings expanded. A mark could represent an object, a sound, a name, or an idea. What began as accounting slowly became language. The clay tablet was no longer only a record of sheep, grain, or jars of oil. It could hold a royal command, a hymn, a legal judgment, a letter between distant people, or a story about a king who feared death. Tonight, we will follow that transformation from marks into words, and from words into memory. We will enter the cities of Sumer, climb toward the temples that watched over them, and sit beside the scribes who learned to give shape to sound. We will see how writing strengthened kings, preserved myths, measured the heavens, and allowed the dead to speak across thousands of years. Yet, before all of that, there was only wet clay, a reed held carefully in the hand, and the first uncertain attempt to make a thought remain. Section 2. Long before writing could preserve a king's command or carry a prayer into the future, it grew inside a city that had already begun to outgrow the world around it. Uruk rose from the southern plains of Mesopotamia, where the land was low, the horizon was wide, and nearly everything depended upon water arriving at the right place. Its houses were built from the same earth that fed its fields, while temples stood above them as signs of devotion and power. Canals carried water toward crops and boats toward markets. Storehouses gathered the harvest. Workshops turned raw material into tools, cloth, pottery, and ornaments. The city became a machine made from human labor, each part depending upon another. To live there was to enter a new kind of human world. In a village, most people could know one another by face and family. In Uruk, strangers passed in the streets. Workers arrived from the countryside. Merchants brought goods from distant regions. Farmers depended upon officials who controlled canals and storage. Priests oversaw temples that were both places of worship and centers of land, labor, and wealth. The city required people to trust systems larger than friendship or kinship. A basket of grain might be grown by one family, carried by another, counted by an official, stored by the temple, and later distributed to workers who had never seen the field from which it came. Such a world could not be held together by memory alone. It needed measures, marks, seals, and records. At the center of Uruk stood sacred buildings devoted to powerful gods, including Inanna, whom later peoples would know by other names. The temple was thought to be the dwelling place of the divine, and the city belonged in a deep sense to the god who watched over it. This belief gave order to a society shaped by hierarchy. Those who managed temple estates controlled fields, animals, workshops, and food. Laborers received rations, craftspeople worked under supervision, and officials became more important because they could direct the movement of goods and people. The first cities did not rise only because human beings wished to live together. They rose because organized labor could reshape the landscape on a scale no household could manage alone. The mud brick walls of Uruk enclosed more than homes. They enclosed a new imagination of what civilization could become. A city could gather thousands of people and direct their strength toward a single project. It could raise platforms, rebuild temples, widen canals, and surround itself with defenses. Southern Mesopotamia had rich soil, but it lacked much of the timber, stone, and metal demanded by ambitious builders and craftspeople. Trade, therefore, became part of the city's breath. Boats moved along rivers and through marshes, while distant materials entered Uruk from mountains, deserts, and coastlands. Yet, the greatness of the city rested upon fragile foundations. Mud bricks softened and crumbled, canals filled with silt. Fields could become salty after generations of irrigation. Floods could tear apart months of work in a single night. Uruk had to be maintained constantly, as though it were a living thing that would begin to die the moment human attention wandered. Every wall needed repair, every channel needed clearing, and every harvest depended upon decisions made long before the grain appeared. This endless labor may be one reason the people of Mesopotamia imagined their gods as demanding beings whose favor could never be taken for granted. The world provided life, but it did not promise safety. As Uruk grew, its influence moved far beyond its walls. Its styles of pottery, administration, architecture, and trade appeared across a wide region. Settlements connected to its networks rose along important routes, and the habits of urban life spread with them. Uruk may not have ruled an empire in the later sense. Its power was more like a pattern repeating across the landscape. Wherever goods were counted, labor organized, and temples raised above surrounding homes, the idea of the city took firmer hold. Human beings were learning that a settlement could become something larger than the people inside it. It could possess an identity, a memory, and ambitions of its own. Later generations would remember Uruk as the city of Gilgamesh, the legendary king who searched for a way to escape death. His story belonged to a later age of writing, when scribes could preserve long poems and copy them from tablet to tablet. But the city that carried his name had already begun the work that made such preservation possible. Uruk gathered enough people, wealth, authority, and fear of forgetting to create a need for words that could remain. Before the epic, before the law code, and before the library, there was the city itself, rising from the plain and asking human memory to become larger than any single mind. Section 3. Before the first signs were pressed into tablets, people had already been searching for ways to make numbers visible. Long before a scribe shaped words from wedges, farmers, herders, merchants, and officials needed to keep track of what they owned, what they owed, and what had been promised. A flock could not be remembered by sight once it had grown large. A storehouse filled with grain could not be trusted to the memory of one keeper. Goods moved from field to temple and from workshop to market, and each exchange created a question that spoken agreement could not always answer. How much had been delivered? Who had received it? What remained? The earliest answers were not sentences. They were small objects shaped by hand. Across the ancient Near East, people used clay tokens to represent quantities and kinds of goods. A cone might stand for one measure, a sphere for another, while a different shape could represent an animal, a jar of oil, or a basket of grain. Instead of holding a number in the mind, a person could hold it in the hand. Several tokens could be gathered together to represent an account, then stored until the agreement was completed. In this quiet way, clay began to carry information before it carried language. As trade and administration became more complicated, these tokens were sometimes sealed inside hollow clay envelopes known today as bulli. The wet clay was folded around the counters, closed and marked with a seal. The envelope protected the account from being altered, but it also created a problem. To check what lay within, the covering had to be broken. At some point, people began pressing the tokens into the outer surface before sealing them inside. Their shapes left impressions that revealed the contents without opening the envelope. A collection of counters had begun to leave a picture of itself in clay. The next step may have seemed almost obvious once it was taken. If the impressions on the outside already showed what the envelope contained, then perhaps the tokens inside were no longer necessary. A flat piece of clay could receive the same marks without enclosing anything at all. The account had moved from object to surface. Instead of keeping 10 counters for 10 measures of grain, a person could mark a tablet and let the marks stand in their place. This was not yet writing in the full sense, because the symbols recorded things rather than speech. Yet, it was a decisive change. Information had become visible and separate from the objects it described. Seals added another layer of meaning. A cylinder seal was a small carved object that could be rolled across wet clay, leaving a continuous image behind. Some showed animals, ceremonies, gods, or figures standing before a ruler. Others identified an official, household, or institution. Rolled across a jar stopper, tablet, or storage container, the seal acted as a signature and a safeguard. It announced that someone with authority had witnessed the transaction. If the impression was broken, tampering could be seen. In a world without paper or handwritten names, a carved stone cylinder could represent identity, permission, and trust. The marks themselves gradually became more abstract. A picture of a head beside a bowl might suggest eating, while another sign could indicate movement, ownership, or work. Numbers were organized into systems suited to grain, land, animals, and time. Scribes learned that one sign could carry more than one meaning, depending upon where it appeared and what stood beside it. The tablet was becoming more than a tally. A mark could point not only to an object that could be touched, but to an action, a sound, a name, or an idea. This transformation did not happen in a single moment, and no one person woke one morning having invented writing as we understand it. The system grew through countless practical adjustments made by people trying to solve immediate problems. A clearer mark prevented confusion. A new sign distinguished one product from another. A sound value allowed a name to be written. Each improvement pushed the clay tablet closer to speech. The earliest scribes were not authors in the later sense. They were administrators, accountants, and keepers of order. Yet, in solving the needs of temples and cities, they created a tool that would eventually carry songs, laws, prayers, letters, and the oldest surviving stories of humankind. There is something deeply human in this beginning. Writing grew from the fear that something important might be forgotten. A debt might vanish into argument. A harvest might be counted wrongly. A promise might change in the telling. Clay offered a way to hold the past still. Once the marks hardened beneath the sun, memory no longer belonged only to the living. It could remain silent for years, centuries, or millennia, waiting for another pair of eyes to understand what a hand had pressed there. Section 4. As the signs of Mesopotamia moved farther from pictures and closer to language, writing became a craft that demanded years of discipline. A tablet no longer held only a count of grain or a record of livestock. It could preserve names, titles, instructions, prayers, and decisions. The marks became smaller and more regular, shaped by the angled end of a reed stylus pressed into soft clay. Each impression left a wedge, and combinations of wedges formed signs whose meaning depended upon order, context, and sound. What had begun as a practical method of keeping accounts was becoming a system capable of carrying the human voice. This new power did not belong equally to everyone. Most people in the cities of Sumer could not read the tablets stored in temples, palaces, and workshops. Writing was controlled by trained specialists who learned how to form signs and understand the language, numbers, measures, and customs hidden within them. A scribe needed a steady hand and a patient memory. Hundreds of signs had to be recognized, copied, and used correctly. Some represented whole words, while others stood for sounds that could be joined together. The same sign might change meaning according to the signs around it. Mastery came slowly, through repetition, until the movements of the stylus became almost instinctive. Young students trained in scribal schools, often described by a later Sumerian phrase meaning the house of tablets. There, they copied the work of those who had learned before them. A teacher might press signs into one side of a tablet and leave the other for the student to imitate. The clay preserved every hesitation. A line pressed too deeply could not be lifted from the surface like ink from paper. An incorrect sign had to be smoothed away while the tablet remained damp or left behind as evidence of failure. Practice tablets found by archaeologists still carry uneven rows, repeated words, and corrections made by hands learning to control the reed thousands of years ago. The schoolroom was strict and demanding. Students rose early, repeated lessons, prepared clay, and worked beneath the attention of teachers and senior pupils. They learned signs and words arranged by subject because order made the vast system easier to hold in memory. Names of trees, stones, animals, professions, cities, and gods were copied until the student could move through the written world without losing his way. Mathematics was equally important. A scribe might measure a field, calculate rations, divide an inheritance, estimate building materials, or record the movement of goods. Training also carried the student into the older language of Sumer. As political power shifted and Akkadian became more widely spoken, scribes continued to study Sumerian because it remained important in ritual, scholarship, and administration. In this way, writing preserved a language after it had begun to fade from ordinary conversation. A young scribe could copy words spoken by distant ancestors and learn hymns composed in a world already ancient to him. The tablet house became one of the earliest places where knowledge was gathered deliberately and passed onward. The life that followed depended upon ability and connection. Some scribes served temples, recording offerings, land, workers, and supplies. Others worked for palaces, where written records strengthened the reach of kings. Merchants employed scribes to prepare contracts and letters that could travel with caravans. Courts needed documents that fixed agreements in clay and allowed witnesses to place their seals beside them. A skilled scribe could move close to authority because rulers depended upon people who could turn spoken orders into permanent records. Writing gave power to the king, but it also gave quiet power to the person who understood the tablet. The clay itself remained humble. It was dug from riverbanks and canals, cleaned, softened with water, and shaped in the palm. Small tablets were often no larger than a hand, while important texts could require broader surfaces or several tablets arranged in sequence. Some were dried in the sun and intended for temporary use. Others hardened in fires, whether deliberately or when cities burned around them. The destruction of buildings sometimes preserved the words inside, baking the tablets until they could survive beneath collapsed walls for thousands of years. By the time cuneiform had matured, a reader could hear more than quantities in its wedges. A letter could carry worry from one city to another. A hymn could praise a goddess in language shaped for ceremony. A judgment could settle a dispute between neighbors. The voice of a ruler could travel beyond the room in which he spoke. Yet, behind every surviving text stood the same careful motion. A reed lowered toward damp clay, pressure applied at an angle, and a human thought given a form that might outlive the hand that made it. Section 5. Writing gave the cities of Mesopotamia a memory, but the temples gave that memory a center. Rising above the crowded houses and narrow streets, the sacred precinct stood apart from ordinary life. Its walls enclosed courtyards, storerooms, workshops, and chambers where offerings were prepared for the god who was believed to dwell there. To the people below, the temple was not simply a building where worship took place. It was the household of a divine power whose favor could bring rain, fertility, protection, and victory, and whose anger might be felt in drought, disease, invasion, or flood. The city belonged to its god, and the temple was the place where that bond was made visible. In the flat landscape of southern Mesopotamia, height carried meaning. Stone was scarce, and timber had to be brought from far away, so the builders worked mainly with mud brick, shaping the earth into platforms that lifted sacred buildings above the plain. Over generations, these platforms grew larger and more imposing. The structure, later known as the ziggurat, rose in stages, each level supporting the next until a shrine stood high above the city. From the streets below, it must have seemed like an artificial mountain built in a country without mountains, a stairway of earth joining the human world to the realm of the gods. Its walls required constant repair because rain and wind slowly returned every brick to mud, yet the people rebuilt them again and again. The temple's influence reached far beyond ceremony. It owned fields, managed herds, employed laborers, and received goods from the countryside. Grain entered its storehouses after harvest, and measured portions were later distributed to workers, dependents, and officials. Wool passed through its workshops and emerged as finished cloth. Boats carried dates, reeds, fish, and clay along the canals, while imported timber, stone, and metal arrived from lands beyond the river plains. Scribes recorded these movements on tablets, fixing each delivery and ration in a pattern of wedges. Religion, work, and administration were not separate parts of life. They met inside the same courtyards and were preserved in the same clay. This closeness between the sacred and the practical shaped the way Mesopotamians understood order. The gods were imagined as powerful beings with needs, tempers, families, and rivalries. They required food, drink, clothing, music, and praise, all presented through ritual. Priests and temple servants cared for divine statues as though the gods were truly present within them. Meals were placed before the image, garments were changed, incense was burned, and hymns were sung at appointed times. The people did not expect to see the god consume the offering in the manner of a human guest. The act itself maintained the relationship. By serving the divine household correctly, the city hoped to preserve harmony in a world that could never be fully controlled. Each city carried its own sacred identity. Uruk was closely bound to Inanna, goddess of love, power, and war, while Eridu was associated with Enki, keeper of the deep waters and wisdom. Nippur honored Enlil, whose authority reached across the land, and looked to the moon god Nanna, whose changing light measured the passage of nights and months. These divine names appeared in prayers, royal inscriptions, personal names, and contracts. A king might claim that a god had chosen him, guided him, or commanded him to rebuild a temple. Victory could be described as divine approval, while defeat could be understood as a sign that favor had been withdrawn. The ruler therefore stood between the city and the gods. He was expected to defend walls, maintain canals, judge disputes, and restore sacred buildings. Inscriptions often presented these duties not as personal achievements, but as work performed at divine command. A king might bury a tablet inside a foundation so that future rulers would know who had built there before them. The words were hidden from ordinary sight, sealed beneath floors or within walls, yet they carried a message across time. The ruler had fulfilled his duty, the god had received a dwelling, and the city had renewed its place in the order of the world. From the top of a temple platform, the whole city could be imagined as a single living body. Smoke rose from hearths, animals moved through alleys, boats passed along canals carrying grain and clay. Beyond the walls, irrigated fields stretched toward the horizon, divided by embankments that required constant attention. Every part depended upon the others, and all of it seemed to rest beneath the gaze of the god above. The ziggurat was therefore more than a monument. It was a promise that the city had not been abandoned, that human labor still had meaning, and that somewhere between the mud below and the sky above, the fragile world of Mesopotamia remained held together. Section 6. The cities of Sumer had learned how to preserve offerings, contracts, and prayers, but writing soon became equally useful to rulers who wished to make their authority reach beyond the sound of their own voices. A king could command soldiers, settle a dispute, or stand before a temple and declare that the gods had favored him. Yet, spoken power faded as soon as the crowd dispersed. A tablet, inscription, or carved monument allowed the same claim to remain. It could be carried into another city, buried beneath a temple, or displayed where generations would pass beneath it. Writing gave kingship a longer memory than any reign. The earliest rulers of southern Mesopotamia governed a landscape divided among rival cities. Uruk, Lagash, Kish, Umma, and others controlled their own fields, canals, temples, and surrounding villages. Their borders were never secure because water, fertile soil, and trade routes could not be shared without tension. A canal diverted upstream might leave another city's fields dry, and a disputed boundary could lead to years of fighting. Armies were raised from men who were usually farmers, laborers, or craftsmen. Victory brought land, tribute, captives, and prestige. Defeat could break a city's walls and place its people beneath a foreign ruler. Writing became part of this struggle. Officials recorded rations for soldiers, supplies for campaigns, and tribute received from defeated communities. Royal inscriptions described battles as proof that a king had fulfilled the will of the gods. These accounts were declarations of order, written from the ruler's side. Enemies appeared as rebels or invaders, while the king stood as the chosen restorer of peace. Even when the reality had been uncertain or brutal, the inscription turned it into a clear story. The god had commanded, the king had acted, and the world had been set right. Among the rulers remembered from this age was Eannatum of Lagash, whose victories were shown on a carved stone monument now called the Stele of the Vultures. Soldiers advance in close formation behind their king, while defeated enemies lie beneath their feet, and birds circle over the dead. The monument also carries writing that explains the conflict through boundaries, oaths, and divine judgment. War had become something that could be narrated and preserved. The dead were made part of a political memory shaped by the victor. The world of competing city-states changed more dramatically when Sargon of Akkad rose to power. His beginnings were later wrapped in legend, but his achievements left a firmer mark. From the city of Akkad, whose exact location has never been securely identified, he brought many Sumerian cities beneath one rule and extended his power across much of Mesopotamia. This was not the first time one city had dominated another, yet the scale was different. Sargon and his successors created a realm in which governors, soldiers, messengers, and officials answered to a central royal house. The king no longer stood only above one city. He claimed authority over a land of many cities, languages, gods, and traditions. Such a realm depended upon communication. Orders had to travel farther than a ruler could ride in a day. Taxes and tribute had to be counted across distant regions. Local officials had to report what had been collected, built, lost, or resisted. Akkadian, a Semitic language already spoken in Mesopotamia, was written using the Cuneiform system first developed for Sumerian. The old signs were adapted to new sounds, proving that writing could move beyond the language in which it had first grown. Cuneiform was no longer the possession of one people or one city. It had become a tool that could be reshaped wherever administration required it. The kings of Akkad also understood the force of image and title. Naram Sin, Sargon's grandson, was shown climbing a mountain above his enemies, larger than the men around him, and wearing a horned crown associated with divinity. The scene presents victory as something greater than a military event. It lifts the king toward the sacred. His power is written into the arrangement of bodies, the upward movement of the stone, and the words that name his triumph. The ruler had become not only the servant of divine order, but a figure who could stand close to the gods themselves. Yet even an empire recorded in clay remained fragile. Rebellions spread, distant regions slipped from control, and later generations remembered Akkad with admiration and warning. The tablets preserved the reach of its rulers, but they also preserved anxiety about what happened when power grew too large to hold. Writing could announce that a king ruled the four quarters of the world. It could not guarantee that the world would obey. Still, the claim survived, and that survival changed kingship forever. From then onward, rulers across Mesopotamia would use words not only to govern, but to shape how the future remembered them. Section 7. As writing moved outward from temples and royal courts, it entered the quieter struggles of ordinary life. A farmer needed proof that a field had been leased. A merchant needed a record of silver owed after a journey. A family needed witnesses when land or property changed hands. Marriage agreements, inheritances, adoptions, wages, loans, and disputes all depended upon memory, and memory was often weakest when the stakes were highest. Clay tablets gave agreements a shape that could survive argument. Once the terms had been pressed into the surface and witnesses had added their seals, a private promise became part of the public order. The courts of Mesopotamia were places where neighbors accused one another, families defended their claims, and officials tried to decide which story carried greater weight. Witnesses were called. Oaths were sworn before the gods. Tablets were examined. A person might bring forward an earlier contract or point to a sealed record stored for years. The written word did not replace testimony, but it gave testimony a companion that could not easily change with time. A tablet could not judge a motive, yet it could preserve the boundaries of a field, the amount of a loan, or the names of those who had agreed. This legal world reached one of its most famous expressions under Hammurabi, king of Babylon in the 18th century before the Common Era. Hammurabi inherited a city that was powerful but not yet dominant. Through war, alliance, and patient expansion, he brought much of Mesopotamia beneath his rule. Like earlier kings, he presented himself as a guardian chosen by the gods, responsible for protecting the weak, restraining violence, and making order visible across the land. Near the end of his reign, a long collection of judgments was carved into dark stone beneath an image of the king standing before Shamash, the god associated with justice and the sun. The monument is often called the Code of Hammurabi, though it was not a modern law book arranged for citizens to consult in daily life. Its hundreds of cases read more like examples of royal judgment. They describe what should happen when a builder's work collapses, when property is stolen, when an ox injures someone, when a marriage fails, when a debt cannot be paid, or when an official abuses his position. The rulings reveal a society deeply concerned with rank, responsibility, family, property, and repayment. Punishments could be severe, and the same injury did not always receive the same response when people of different social standing were involved. Justice was presented as order, but it was an order shaped by hierarchy. The famous principle remembered as an eye for an eye belonged to this larger attempt to measure punishment rather than allow endless revenge. It did not mean that every wrong received the same penalty. Instead, the judgments tried to set boundaries around retaliation and compensation. Harm was to be answered according to recognized rules, not only by the anger of the injured family. In practice, decisions still depended upon judges, witnesses, custom, and power. Yet, the written judgments created the image of a kingdom in which justice came from a stable source and could be known beyond the palace. For ordinary people, the most important legal tablets were often much smaller than Hammurabi's monument. They fit in the hand and recorded the details of one life. A woman might secure property through a marriage agreement. Brothers might divide an inheritance after their father's death. A merchant might lend silver at interest and require repayment after the harvest. A person could be adopted not only as a child, but as part of an arrangement involving care, property, or inheritance. These records show a practical world where family affection existed beside obligation, and survival often depended upon terms agreed before witnesses. Scribes gave these moments their permanent form. They knew the language of contracts, the proper order of names, and the phrases that turned an agreement into a legal record. A tablet might be wrapped in a second layer of clay, with the same terms repeated on the outer surface. If someone later altered the visible text, the sealed inner tablet could be opened and compared with it. Trust was supported by structure, and the clay itself became a barrier against deception. Writing had now traveled far from the first marks used to count grain. It stood inside marriages, debts, accusations, inheritances, and punishments. It could protect a person, bind them, or place them at the mercy of rules written by those with greater power. The tablet did not make the world fair, and a carved law did not guarantee mercy, but it changed the nature of justice by making decisions last. A judgment could be remembered after the judge was gone, and a king could present himself to the future as the one who had given order a voice. Section 8. Beyond the courts and palaces, writing traveled with merchants. Mesopotamia possessed fertile soil and great rivers, but the southern plains offered little timber, stone, or metal. Cities that wished to build temples, cast tools, and decorate shrines had to reach outward. Boats moved along the Euphrates and through the marshes toward the Persian Gulf, while caravans crossed dry country toward mountain passes and distant settlements. Copper came from lands beyond the sea, timber from upland forests, and stone from regions where the earth rose hard above the plain. Trade tied Mesopotamia to a world larger than its rulers could fully command, and writing helped hold those connections together. A merchant preparing for a journey faced dangers that no tablet could remove. Boats could sink, pack animals could fail, roads could close, and political trouble could turn a familiar route into hostile ground. Goods might be stolen or damaged, and a partner in another city might deny the terms of an agreement. Written contracts reduced some of that uncertainty. They recorded who had invested silver, who was responsible for the cargo, how profit would be divided, and when repayment was expected. Witnesses placed their seals beside the text, and the tablet remained behind as a memory of the arrangement. The journey still depended upon trust, but trust had been given a shape. Some of the clearest voices from this world survive in letters exchanged by Assyrian merchants working far from home. In trading colonies across Anatolia, men bought and sold textiles, tin, and silver, while their families managed households and businesses in the city of Asher. Their messages were pressed into small clay tablets, enclosed in clay envelopes, and carried across hundreds of miles. They did not speak only of prices and cargo. They complained about delays, worried over debts, questioned relatives, defended their decisions, and demanded answers from people who had failed to write back. Through them, the ancient world becomes unexpectedly close. A husband asks why a shipment has not arrived. A wife reminds him that the household needs money. Brothers accuse one another of neglect. Business and family are woven together in the same hurried words. These letters reveal that commerce was rarely the work of one traveler acting alone. A merchant depended upon relatives, agents, carriers, partners, and creditors. Someone remained at home to buy cloth, arrange loans, and receive news. Another waited in a distant town to sell the goods at the right moment. A caravan leader guided animals across the route, while officials collected fees at gates and crossings. Writing allowed this network to stretch across space, because instructions could travel where the merchant himself could not. The clay letter was slower than speech, but more durable. Its sender dictated to a scribe or wrote it personally, then watched the damp tablet become a sealed message. The recipient might break the envelope weeks later and hear the absent person through the signs within. Tone could be sharp, affectionate, anxious, or weary. A formal greeting might quickly give way to anger over unpaid silver or frustration with a relative who had ignored earlier instructions. The distance between two people remained, yet writing made that distance bearable. It allowed a thought to leave one household and arrive in another without changing along the road. Trade also carried writing into new lands and languages. Cuneiform signs were adapted wherever rulers and merchants found them useful. Diplomatic letters passed between courts. Contracts appeared in foreign cities. Local scribes learned the system and reshaped it to fit their own speech. The script that had begun in the storehouses of southern Mesopotamia became an international instrument, capable of recording agreements between people who worshipped different gods and spoke in different tongues. A clay tablet could cross a border more easily than an army and remain useful long after the ruler who ordered it had died. Yet every surviving letter is also a fragment of a larger silence. Many tablets dissolved when buildings collapsed or rain returned them to mud. Others remain buried beneath towns, fields, and roads. What survives is uneven, shaped by chance and fire. Still, the words we possess reveal a civilization held together not only by kings and temples, but by people trying to move goods, protect families, settle accounts, and make themselves understood across distance. In the quiet pressure of a reed against clay, the merchant found a way to be present while absent. His instructions could wait in another city. His promise could stand before witnesses. His worry could reach home long after he had left. Writing had become more than the memory of a city. It had become a bridge between separated lives, carrying the ordinary weight of work, affection, impatience, and hope along the roads of the ancient world. Section 9. Once writing could preserve trade, law, and royal command, the people of Mesopotamia began using it to record something far less obedient than human affairs. Above the cities, the sky moved with a rhythm that seemed orderly, even when life below was not. The moon widened and vanished, planets wandered among the fixed stars, and familiar constellations returned with the seasons. To farmers, priests, sailors, and kings, these movements were never meaningless. They marked the passage of time and appeared to reveal the intentions of powers greater than any city. The same clay that held a merchant's debt could also hold the memory of a night sky. The moon provided one of the clearest measures. Its changing shape divided time into months, while the rising and setting of the sun gave structure to each day. Yet, lunar months did not fit perfectly within the solar year. Without correction, the calendar would slowly drift away from the seasons upon which planting and harvest depended. Priests and officials watched the heavens and added an extra month when necessary so that festivals and agricultural duties remained in their proper place. Time was not simply observed, it had to be named, adjusted, and written down. This work depended upon mathematics. Mesopotamian scribes used numerical systems capable of handling quantities far beyond ordinary counting. One of the most important was built around 60, a number that could be divided cleanly in many ways. It proved useful for measuring land, portions, time, and angles, and its influence survived long after the cities that developed it had fallen. Their mathematics served daily life, but it also became a field of study. Tablets preserve calculations involving fields, canals, bricks, interest, and grain. A scribe might estimate how much earth had to be removed while digging a channel or determine the supplies needed for a workforce. Other tablets contain exercises created for students, showing methods for finding unknown quantities and working with squares and roots. The purpose was familiar: to create a reliable path from a difficult question toward an answer another mind could follow. The heavens presented a greater challenge because their patterns unfolded across years and generations. A single priest might remember one eclipse or one unusual movement of a planet, but writing allowed observations to accumulate beyond a human lifetime. Night after night, scholars noted where a planet appeared, when the moon rose, and whether darkness crossed its face. A watcher standing on a temple platform inherited earlier tablets, expectations, and mistakes. Through this chain of attention, Mesopotamian astronomy became one of the ancient world's longest efforts to understand the heavens. Observation was never completely separated from religion. The sky was believed to speak. An eclipse, a strange glow around the moon, or the unexpected appearance of a planet could be interpreted as a warning concerning the king, the harvest, an approaching enemy, or the health of the land. Scholars gathered these signs into collections and compared what had appeared above with what was believed to have followed below. Prediction and omen grew from the same careful attention. Kings relied upon advisors who could interpret these signs. A troubling omen might lead to rituals intended to turn danger away, while a favorable one could strengthen confidence before a campaign or ceremony. In some periods, an eclipse believed to threaten the ruler led to the temporary installation of a substitute king, allowing the true king to withdraw until the danger was thought to have passed. Such acts reveal how seriously celestial events were taken. The movement of distant bodies could alter decisions inside the palace. Over centuries, Babylonian scholars became increasingly skilled at recognizing cycles. They learned that events which seemed sudden could belong to repeating patterns. Planetary movements could be anticipated, and eclipses could sometimes be expected within known periods. Prediction did not remove the sacred meaning of the sky, but it changed the relationship between fear and knowledge. An eclipse remained powerful, yet it was no longer entirely surprising. The heavens could remain mysterious without appearing chaotic. The surviving tablets preserve an extraordinary patience. Many contain no grand declaration, only dates, positions, weather, river levels, and celestial events placed carefully beside one another. Their creators were serving temples, kings, scholarship, and the gods of their own age. Still, every recorded night extended human memory beyond one lifetime. Writing had begun by counting what was stored upon the earth. Now it was reaching upward, trying to measure the silent order of the sky. Section 10. Once writing had learned to count grain, settle disputes, carry orders, and follow the movements of the sky, it began to hold something even more difficult to preserve: the stories a people told about themselves. For generations, tales had passed from voice to voice beside hearths, in temple courtyards, and during ceremonies whose words belonged to memory. A singer could reshape a story for the people before him, and a priest could repeat a hymn learned from an older teacher. Yet every telling changed slightly. Names shifted, scenes expanded, and details disappeared. When scribes began pressing these traditions into clay, they did not freeze them forever, but they gave them a form that could travel beyond the moment of performance. Among the oldest surviving works are hymns offered to gods whose presence shaped every part of Mesopotamian life. These compositions praised divine power, described sacred cities, and asked for protection, mercy, or favor. Some were written for public ceremony, while others carried the voice of an individual speaking in fear or gratitude. The language could be formal and richly patterned, yet beneath it remained a familiar human need. People wanted to be heard by forces they could not see. They wanted illness explained, danger turned aside, and suffering placed within an order larger than chance. Writing allowed those pleas to remain after the singer's breath had faded. Scribes also preserved laments for cities that had fallen. In these texts, walls collapse, temples are abandoned, and streets once crowded with life become silent. The destruction is explained through the withdrawal or anger of the gods, but the sorrow feels deeply human. A city was more than brick and canal. It held homes, graves, markets, memories, and the names of generations. When it was lost, the people who survived needed words large enough to contain the absence. The lament gave disaster a shape and turned grief into something that could be repeated, shared, and remembered. The most famous story to emerge from this tradition follows Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. His tale did not appear all at once. It grew through separate Sumerian poems and later Akkadian versions copied and reshaped by generations of scribes. In the story, Gilgamesh begins as a ruler of overwhelming strength whose people suffer beneath his pride. The gods create Enkidu, a wild man of the open country, to stand against him. Their struggle becomes friendship, and together they seek danger, glory, and names that will not be forgotten. Yet victory cannot protect them from loss. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is forced to face the fate he had treated as distant. His grief sends him beyond the safety of the city. He crosses wilderness and darkness in search of Utnapishtim, the survivor of a great flood who has been granted a life beyond ordinary human limits. Gilgamesh hopes to learn the secret of escaping death, but the journey strips that hope away. Even when he is offered a final chance through a plant said to restore youth, it is stolen by a serpent while he rests. He returns to Uruk without immortality, carrying only the knowledge that human life is bounded and that no king, however powerful, can command time to stop. The flood story within the epic belongs to a much wider Mesopotamian tradition. Long before later versions appeared elsewhere, scribes recorded tales of a divine decision to destroy humankind, a chosen survivor warned to build a vessel, animals brought aboard, waters covering the land, and birds released to search for dry ground. The details changed across languages and centuries, but the memory remained. Perhaps it carried the distant echo of real floods that had devastated settlements along the rivers. Perhaps it also expressed a deeper fear that civilization itself could be erased in a single overwhelming event. By writing these stories, Mesopotamian scribes created more than entertainment. They preserved questions that had no simple administrative answer. Why do the gods allow suffering? What does a person owe a friend? Can fame defeat death? What remains when a city falls? The tablets do not solve these questions. They allow them to endure. A reader in Babylon could encounter a king from an age already ancient, just as a reader now can hear the same grief across thousands of years. This may be the greatest change brought by the first written words. Clay began as a tool for holding numbers still, but it eventually learned to carry fear, devotion, friendship, and loss. Through writing, the people of Mesopotamia discovered that a voice could survive the body that made it. The storyteller might disappear, the temple might collapse, and the city might return to dust. Yet the words could wait beneath the ruins until another human being found them and listened once more. Section 11. For thousands of years, Cuneiform carried the memory of Mesopotamia. Kingdoms rose and disappeared, languages changed, and new rulers entered cities whose temples had already been rebuilt many times. The script adapted to each age and language. Scribes copied older works because they believed the past still contained knowledge worth preserving. A tablet written centuries earlier might be studied and copied again, allowing a voice from a vanished city to remain present in a later one. Nowhere is this devotion clearer than in the libraries gathered by Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria in the 7th century before the Common Era. From his capital at Nineveh, he ruled an empire known for military power, but he also valued learning with unusual intensity. He claimed that he could read difficult signs and understand texts many rulers could not. Under his command, scribes searched temples and scholarly collections across Mesopotamia, copying rituals, medical works, omens, hymns, prayers, royal inscriptions, and ancient stories. It became a royal archive meant to gather the wisdom of the world beneath one roof. Inside its rooms, tablets were arranged by subject and marked with notes that helped scribes place them in sequence. Some works extended across many tablets and ended with a line naming the series or the next section. Copies were checked against older versions, and damaged passages were marked rather than silently invented. The scribes knew that preserving a text required more than keeping an object safe. The words themselves had to be transmitted faithfully. Yet, Nineveh was not built to last forever. Near the end of the 7th century before the Common Era, enemies broke through the Assyrian capital. Palaces burned, roofs collapsed, and rooms filled with debris. What looked like the destruction of the library became the reason much of it survived. Fire hardened many clay tablets beneath the ruins. Wooden shelves vanished, walls fell, and the empire passed into history, but the words remained buried in darkness. The disaster that silenced the city protected thousands of fragments for another age. Cuneiform continued for centuries after Assyria fell. Babylonian scholars still watched the heavens, copied rituals, and recorded knowledge while new empires ruled the region. Gradually, alphabetic scripts on lighter materials became more common. They were easier to learn and better suited to the languages gaining influence. The old tablet tradition narrowed into temples and scholarly circles until the final known cuneiform texts were written near the beginning of the Common Era. After that, the signs fell silent. People still lived among the mounds of ancient cities, but the words inside them could no longer be read. For nearly 2,000 years, Mesopotamia's written memory remained closed. Broken tablets surfaced without revealing their meaning, and monumental inscriptions appeared as patterns no living scholar understood. Only in the modern age did the script begin to open again. Scholars compared repeated signs, royal names, and inscriptions written in several languages. The great inscription at Behistun proved especially important because versions of the same royal message appeared in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform. Slowly, the wedges gave up their sounds. Decipherment required patience because cuneiform was never a single simple code. Signs could represent words, syllables, or ideas, and their meaning shifted between languages and periods. Scholars argued, revised one another, and tested their readings against new tablets. When they finally translated complete texts, a lost world returned in fragments. Kings spoke again from ruined palaces. Merchants complained about delayed payments. Students struggled through exercises. Priests recited hymns. Astronomers recorded eclipses. And Gilgamesh mourned his friend. There is a quiet irony in this survival. Mesopotamian scribes chose clay because it was useful, cheap, and close at hand, not because they imagined museums thousands of years in the future. Papyrus and parchment could burn or rot, while clay often endured because it was heavy, awkward, and buried. Entire libraries broke into pieces, yet those pieces waited. Every fragment carried the possibility that one more sentence might return. By the time the tablets were read again, the civilizations that made them had become ruins. Their rivers had shifted, their temples had collapsed, and their gods were no longer worshipped in the old cities. Still, the pressure of each reed remained visible. A thumbprint might survive on the edge of a tablet, or a student's mistake remain beneath a teacher's correction. Through these marks, the first writers ceased to be distant symbols of progress and became human hands once more, working carefully in wet clay and trusting that what they wrote was worth keeping. Section 12. The first written words were not declarations meant to change the world. They began with the pressure of daily life. Grain had to be counted, labor measured, property identified, and promises protected from the weakness of memory. A reed touched wet clay because a city had become too large to hold itself entirely within the minds of its people. Yet, from that practical beginning came something far greater. Once a mark could stand for a sound, and sounds could be joined together, human thought gained a second life. Words no longer had to vanish when the speaker fell silent. Across centuries, Mesopotamia used that discovery to build a memory larger than one generation. Temples recorded offerings, kings preserved commands, merchants sent instructions across long roads, while families fixed marriages, inheritances, and debts in clay. Scholars watched the moon and planets, then compared what they saw with observations made by people long dead. Poets shaped old tales into works that could be carried forward. The same system that began with jars of grain eventually held fear, grief, devotion, and the search for meaning. Writing also changed power. A ruler could make his authority travel farther than his body and last beyond his reign. A court could return to an earlier agreement. A temple could manage land and workers across many seasons. The written record brought order, but it also strengthened the institutions that controlled it. Those who could read stood closer to government, religion, and trade. The tablet could protect a farmer's claim or bind him to a debt. It could preserve justice or give permanence to the voice of the powerful. Writing did not make civilization fair. It made civilization more capable of remembering what it had decided. That memory was never complete. The people who appear most clearly in the surviving tablets are often those whose lives touched institutions strong enough to keep records. Countless others passed through the same streets without leaving a name behind. Laborers dug canals, carried bricks, harvested fields, and rebuilt walls that later collapsed. Mothers comforted children, neighbors argued, and travelers rested beside the rivers, yet much of their world disappeared without being written. Even in the birthplace of recorded history, most human lives remained beyond the tablet. Still, the fragments that survived are enough to alter the silence. A receipt for barley may seem small beside a royal monument, but both reveal the desire to make an event remain. A student's uneven signs preserve a morning of frustration in a distant schoolroom. A merchant's complaint carries impatience across 4,000 years. A hymn allows us to hear how people approached a god they feared and loved. The clay cannot return the ancient world whole, but real voices can still be heard through it. Mesopotamia itself changed beyond recognition. Rivers shifted, canals dried, and cities once surrounded by fields became mounds beneath the dust. Uruk, Babylon, and Nineveh passed through conquest, rebuilding, and abandonment. Their walls returned slowly to the earth from which they had been raised. Yet beneath those ruins, tablets remained. Some were hardened by fire, others protected by collapsed rooms, and many still wait below ground. The cities lost their streets and roofs, but part of their memory endured because clay had learned to speak. The question of who wrote the first words can never be answered with a single name. No monument identifies one inventor standing at the beginning of history. Writing emerged through the work of many hands, across generations of experiment and need. Account keepers, seal cutters, temple officials, merchants, teachers, and scribes each shaped the system into something more capable than before. The first writer may not have understood what had begun. A mark made to record grain was enough to open the path. That path spread far beyond Mesopotamia. Other peoples developed scripts of their own, while cuneiform crossed borders and adapted itself to new languages. Writing became so familiar that the strangeness of its invention is easy to forget. Every page, inscription, message, and screen still depends upon the same basic miracle. A visible sign can awaken a sound or idea inside another mind. Someone absent can speak. Someone dead can be remembered. A thought can wait. And so the first words remain with us, not because they were grand, but because they stayed. Their makers pressed them into the simplest material they knew and trusted the clay to hold what memory could not. In the next chapter, our journey will move east toward the planned cities of the Indus Valley, where another ancient people left signs that still resist every attempt to read them. There, the mystery will not be how writing began, but why a written world can survive while its voice remains silent. The fourth chapter of the Book of Ancient Worlds has now come to an end. The first cities have grown quiet once more, and the marks pressed into clay have returned to the darkness beneath their ruins. For now, there is nothing more you need to follow or remember. Let the music carry you gently towards sleep. Allow the archive to fade into the distance as your thoughts become slower, softer, and still. Rest well, seekers. Good night.